Hi, my name is Lachlan Ermatinger. I am an undergrad at Montana State University, and today I'll be talking about the work I'm doing for the Wheatstem Sawfly Lab. If you came to my earlier presentation, some of this content will be review, but this project is focused on outlining all the spatial dimensions studied to suppress the Wheatstem Sawfly. In this presentation, I will cover the Wheatstem Sawfly and its prominent parasitoids, tools available to producers to manage sawfly severity, the spatial dimensions studied by researchers in our lab, the decision-making process producers of cereal crops employ regarding the sawfly, and finally, the future projects anticipated. The wheatstem sawfly was first documented as a pest of cereal crops in the beginning of the 20th century and is currently the most detrimental pest to wheat in North America. In the northern Great Plains, it's estimated to be responsible for $350 million in lost revenue annually. In Montana alone, it's seen to cause around $80 million in loss annually. The map displayed in the center represents the areas that are most impacted by wheatstem sawfly severity. The sawfly relies on hollow stem grasses and cereal crops to reproduce. With the advent of widespread cereal crop production, sawfly preference began to favor crops like wheat, especially winter wheat, because it often is a more suitable host than native grasses or other cereals at the time sawflies are laying their eggs. Sawflies reproduce by laying their eggs inside stems during the beginning of the growing season. The larvae travel up and down the stem, feeding on the plant pith. At the end of the growing season, the immature moves to the bottom of the stem and creates a cocoon to prepare for diapause. During this process, the sawfly cuts the stem above it in a radial fashion. This leaves the stem brittle, and forces such as wind will make it fall. Once the seed head has fallen over, it can't be picked up by a combine. The image on the right shows you how little of the stem is left once the sawfly has made its cut. Even if the seed does not fall, sawfly infestation is seen to decrease grain weight and quality. And unfortunately for producers, options like pesticides, planting tolerant varieties, and swathing create additional expenses and often don't do a great job at significantly stopping the sawfly. Currently, producers of wheat have rather limited options of sawfly control. A common practice is to orient fields to have a low perimeter to area ratio. This is because the sawfly is known to heavily infest the edges of fields. No-till is another practice that producers employ to try to mitigate sawfly damage. This will help keep parasitoids from the previous season alive. Swathing is one of the few in-season management strategies. Farmers will swath the edges of their field just before harvest when they notice sawfly cutting is bad. By doing this, they can windrow the wheat and pick it up with a combine. One of the most popular strategies is planting solid stem cultivars. Solid stem wheat varieties are known to have a higher immature sawfly mortality rate, so they essentially have a degree of tolerance, while hollow stem varieties have little ability to tolerate infestation, but the trade-off is usually the hollow stem varieties have a higher yield than the solid stem varieties do. Besides these management strategies, the sawfly has two natural enemies, Burkoncephi and Burkon lysigaster. These species are bivoltine, which means they have 2 generations per year. They reproduce by laying their eggs in wheat stems that are infested with sawfly larvae. The larvae of the parasitoid consume the immature sawfly and create a cocoon inside its remains. The second generation of the parasitoids overwinter in the stem and exit through a small hole in the stem the following spring. This aspect of the life cycle has important implications because practices like tilling or cutting wheat stubble low to the ground will kill a higher percentage of parasitoids as opposed to no-till or leaving wheat stubble taller. Because these parasitoids can only lay their eggs in stems that are infested with wheat stem sawflies, they are referred to as conservation biological control agents. In theory, this means we can augment their numbers to suppress the sawfly without significantly influencing other ecological interactions. One important aspect of our lab is the work students are doing to promote the effectiveness of the parasitoids to control wheat stem sawfly. Research has shown that supplementing parasitoid diets with carbohydrates like sucrose is seen to increase important life history traits such as egg load, volume, and longevity. This phenomenon is not unique to parasitoids of the wheat stem sawfly. Supplementing the diets of parasitoids of other pests has also been seen to increase these traits. Studies in rice and potato systems have increased the abundance of these resources on the landscape and observed an improved ability of the parasitoids to suppress their target pests. Additionally, trials of rearing parasitoids on species that produce extrafloral nectar like buckwheat and cowpea have shown the same trend. So exploiting this interaction in field conditions could prove beneficial in the fight against the sawfly. Now to think about the spatial dimensions involved in our work, there are 4 projects that will be outlined in this presentation. The first one is a comprehensive survey of wildland flowering plants on a 30-acre relict prairie site. The second one explores the broader landscape of the Golden Triangle in regards to examining the distribution of potentially beneficial habitats of parasitoids. The third project investigates introducing supplementary nectar resources in close proximity to wheat fields. And the final project I will cover is focused on using remotely sensed data to estimate sawfly infestation in wheat fields. Currently, there is a lack of knowledge as to what flowering plants benefit parasitoids. This is why we intensely surveyed a 30-acre piece of grassland for the presence of flowering species. To do so, we made 6 trips spaced 14 days apart during the summer of 2019. During these trips, we plotted 10-meter wide transects spaced 10 meters apart. For every actively flowering plant observed, we recorded the location, species, and quantity of individual plants. We were able to collect data on over 21,000 observations. In total, we observed 56 different species in our site. While many of the species were rarely seen, 10 accounted for 72% of the total observations. Additionally, the literature suggests that some of the species we observed are potentially beneficial to parasitoids of the wheat stem sawfly. These species include alfalfa, velvety goldenrod, hairy false golden aster, and yarrow. More information on this project is available in my other presentation within the Natural Resource and Conservation track. We are also interested in how areas similar to the one we studied in Havre exist across the Golden Triangle. This region is defined as the area between Conrad, Havre, and Great Falls. It earned the name because of the abundance of wheat and other cereal crops that are grown in this region. Most of our projects have field sites in this area, so for the sake of a consistent definition, we defined it as the 13 surrounding counties. To begin the process of describing areas of habitat that may be beneficial to parasitoids, we opted to create a supervised land cover classification from the ground up. We decided to do this because there is currently little known about the habitat specifications that benefit parasitoids, so this project serves to begin building that definition. To make the project easier to revisit, we use Google Earth Engine. Earth Engine uses a JavaScript, so it makes workflows reproducible and easy to understand. We defined 5 classes so that we had just enough spectral differences to accurately isolate our class of interest for beneficial parasitoid habitat, which we called rangeland. Next, we used the USDA's product Cropscape to describe all agricultural lands that had the potential to harbor sawfly populations. We next buffered that region and intersected it with our parasitoid habitat class. A more in-depth overview of this work is also outlined in the presentation mentioned earlier. This is a work in progress and more study is needed to describe areas of habitat that are beneficial to parasitoids. The idea of flower strips got me thinking about how feasible it would be to actually implement. So I decided to interview producers about their experience with the sawfly and ask them what they thought about dedicating small areas to the production of natural habitat to promote the function of parasitoids. I was able to interview 5 producers over the phone who are all members of the Montana Grain Growers Association. The Montana Grain Growers Association is dedicated to sustainable growing practices in Montana, especially by promoting scientific investigation. So I asked these guys some general questions to get a sense of how they farm and their experiences with the sawfly. As you can see, all these farmers have had very similar experiences. For the most part, they grow the same crops and use the same management techniques. The biggest difference there was with swathing and no-till. Producer number 2 said he swaths his hollow stem varieties every year because that's how bad the infestation usually is. All these farmers also said that drought and sawfly were their 2 biggest issues, and all noted that sawfly infestation recently has been bad and seems to be getting worse. From my conversations, my biggest takeaway was that the sawfly infestation is getting worse and current management practices are not sufficient. For the second part of the interview, I explained the work my colleagues have been doing on supplementing the diets of parasitoids, and that in the future we are interested in growing these resources in and around wheat fields to examine the effect. So I posed the question as a hypothetical and asked if they had lands in their operation that were either chronically low producing, tough to farm, or inactive, that they may consider employing a non-cash crop on to benefit parasitoids. 2 producers said no, Their reasoning was they would need to see very concrete beneficial results before employing this tactic. They also said that based on the economics and stressors of wheat, they try to maximize the amount of area in production. Two producers said yes to this hypothetical. In this scenario, I was hoping to draft up maps with the producers, but we were unable to develop them. Developing these maps would help researchers to understand how much land could be used to design a flower strip and what species may suit that land. One of the farmers wants to interseed cowpea this year. This will offer a good opportunity to study the interaction in the field. Producers can really only estimate their sawfly infestation visually by looking at the percentage of fallen stems near the end of the growing season. We estimate infestation by collecting samples from the field and later dissecting stems in the lab. Depending on the project objectives and size of the field, we generally grab around 100 samples per field. To take a sample, we uproot all the stems along 30 centimeters of a row. For projects that are only quantifying infestation, processing each sample takes about an hour. Projects that measure other parameters take longer. To make this process more efficient and help growers understand infestation patterns, we are looking at using remotely sensed data to quantify infestation. So far, we've done one season of this work. We first started by growing plants in the greenhouse and using a hyperspectral sensor to compare spectral variation between infested and uninfested plants. Based on data from the greenhouse trial and a past study, we found 3 weeks after infestation, bands in the red and near infrared were most important for distinguishing infested stems from uninfested ones. Last season, we took this principle to the field to see if we could estimate infestation based on multispectral data and ground truth infestation samples. We collected 45 samples from a spring wheat field for this project. Because the wheat was not yet harvested, we weren't able to collect from a large area of the field. We trained random forest models using our ground truth infestation data and the difference in imagery between 3 weeks after infestation and the predicted peak infestation date. The mean infestation was around 20%, which is very low, especially when thinking about the answers I got from other producers in the region. So because of that, we defined low infestation as below 25% and high as above 25%. We found that the model using the GNDVI performed better than models using other vegetative indices. Because we only ran the model on samples from a relatively small region of the field, we wanted to collect validation data from a larger portion of the field and see if the model would still hold up. So we went back and collected 100 more samples for validation. As you can see at this point, there was only stubble remaining, but because sawflies overwinter in the very bottom of the stem near the soil surface, we were still able to detect significant infestations. Dissecting these samples is also much more time efficient. So we validated the existing model using these samples and found that the model held up for the most part. As you can see, the most confusion in the model was introduced in the high infestation class, but overall the model performed pretty well for a first attempt. It should be noted that defining low infestation as below 25% and high infestation as above 25% are unrealistic cutoffs. Most producers would be interested in knowing where the field has infestation that is greater than 70%. This technique shows merit, and next season we will collect more samples, hopefully from fields with higher infestation, for the sake of understanding how well this technique can work. In thinking about the projects described in their spatial dimensions, it makes sense to keep them in one succinct place. To do so, we started using ArcGIS Online. Before having access to an Esri license, data and workflows were often kept on personal computers. Using ArcGIS Online makes it easy to store data and projects in a way that ensures they are easy to revisit. As a GIS user, I've noticed it can be very messy to be brought into a project, especially if you are unfamiliar with the work. Having easy access to data and being able to understand the workflows can help further develop these important projects on their long-running timelines. This aspect is especially important when multiple researchers handle the data throughout the life of a project. The wheat stem sawfly is a dynamic pest that has been a major problem for over a century. It demands advancing technologies to stay ahead of. Thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation today. I would also like to thank Dr. Weaver, Dr. Powell, Laisa Cavallini, Ricardo Lima Pinto, and especially all the members of the Wheat Stem Sawfly Laboratory for their contribution and support. Thank you.